so I have not had a chance to introduce myself to all of you personally, but I have had such a wonderful time already and look forward to answering your questions. Ms. Perillo had suggested that I go up on the stage, but I prefer an intimate environment as much as possible, and I should like, if you don't mind, that I step even a little bit closer.
Where are you from? Good South?
I'm from Montpelier in Orange County, Virginia, madam. And I'm enjoying my stay here in New York very much. And I shall endeavor to answer Ms. Perillo's first question regarding what it was like to be elected the President of the United States. And in order to give a proper answer, I think that it should require that I explain to you how important this particular relationship I have with Mr. Jefferson is. And as you know, I am the 4th President of the United States, and since it is 18 and 16 now, I am serving out and completing my 2nd term, and I shall not be running for a 3rd term. And that is because of what our first President, General George Washington, recommended. His Excellency, our Continental General in our first American Revolution, said, "No president should serve more than 2 consecutive terms." And I must admit, at 65 years old, I'm not sure I could stand another term. However, we must answer this question with a little bit of background. Some of you might not be aware that Mr. Jefferson and I share a very close friendship. And I can tell you that you could even quote me on this, that Mr. Jefferson and I, for nigh on 40 years now, have enjoyed a mutual confidence and cordial friendship without interruption or diminution for a single moment in a single instance. So Mr. Jefferson lives but 30 miles from me in Monticello in the Piedmont area of Virginia, where the plantations are and we grow all the crops. And he also, by the way, has a 2nd plantation down south of there called Poplar Forest, and it's his escape. Even though he enjoys a working farm there, he usually goes by himself. It's a 2-day travel, or simply accompanied by one of his staff members. So our past goes all the way back to 1776, the year that we declared our independence from Great Britain. He and I served together in the state of Virginia on a particular committee that had to do with religious freedom. He and I are both very, very big advocates of having complete religious freedom, not just religious tolerance, but complete religious freedom. And since I am 8 years younger than Mr. Jefferson, he recognized this young, short lad and said, well, this young gentleman might have some important things to say, and he took me under his wing a bit, and we became fast friends. And as time progressed and we instituted the United States Constitution in 1787, it got ratified in the following year. President Washington was elected in 1789. I became a member of the House of Representatives then, and served continually in that regard through Mr. Adams' presidency until Mr. Jefferson was elected our 3rd president at the turn of the century. And at that time, he needed a Secretary of State, and he thought that I would be the best person to fill that position. And I heartily accepted, even though my stomach took a turn or two, because, you know, being in that honorable position did carry a bit of stress with it. And so since he was reelected, I carried along as his Secretary of State right along with him. So I was actually groomed for the presidency, I would say. So when Ms. Perillo asks me what it's like to seek election for the presidency, it was anticipated that I would at least run. And I ran against a gentleman named Charles Coatsworth Pinckney from South Carolina, a Federalist, and did win that election by a relatively large margin. And the people saw fit to re-elect me, and I am happy to follow Mr. Washington's tenet of not seeking a 3rd term, and hoping that the gentlemen here will pass along their vote for my Secretary of State, who Mr. Jefferson and I have groomed for the presidency, very similar to what he did with me. And I believe he's in the perfect position to take my place, not only serving as Secretary of State, but Secretary of War, and also in diplomatic positions over in England and in France. So I hope that gives you somewhat of an overview of what it was like for my personal situation in order to be elected as your chief magistrate. Does that suffice?
You mentioned earlier that you had a problem with your home, with a terrible storm. Could you
yes.
tell us about that?
Well, perhaps since you're from New York and the federal city, sometimes we call it the Washington City, you know, the 10-mile square area that's devoted to be the federal government, was attacked in 1814, 2 years ago, by Great Britain as part of our second war for independence, which began 2 years prior to that in 1812 when I asked Congress to declare war on June the 1st. June the 18th, they complied, and we had a series of battles here in New York. The beginning of the war was largely fought in your state, up in the Plattsburgh area, and on Lake Champlain, and on Lake Erie, and Lake Ontario, and near the Canadian border, and all the way out to Detroit. We suffered some quite egregious losses at that time. But by the time the campaign moved south into the Chesapeake area in 1814, we had a land invasion. Great Britain landed their forces in Elkhead, Maryland, and marched towards the federal city. And my Secretary of War, John Armstrong, insisted that they would not target the federal city. And I was advised by everyone else that, of course, they would target the federal city. And I was quite sure that they might do the same as well. Well, they ended up coming up and fighting a battle in Bladensburg in nearby Maryland, and then coming down from the south and invading the federal city. Well, something very unusual happened, and it was bizarre, and I don't know if it will ever happen again. How many of you are aware that Mrs. Madison and I do not occupy the President's mansion? We rent an apartment in the federal city just like a citizen like anyone else does. And that is because of what this bizarre event was all about, the weather. It was a very hot day in the 90s. And the British soldiers, in their full packs, 60 pounds of gear and their full wool, were marching towards the federal city. But the heat got to many of them, and they were falling. And some of them perished from heat exhaustion. But at the same time, at about 2 o'clock on a perfectly sunny day, the clouds began to roll in. Then the wind began to pick up. And then it began to rain. But it didn't only rain, it came down as hail, as ice, big pellets, pummeling everyone. And then the wind picked up so much that the men began lifting in air. And the wind picked up even more than that. You know how heavy a cannon is. Hundreds of pounds for a cannon. They lifted a cannon and moved it aside. And then the piece de resistance of whatever this weather event was a tornado that must have began offshore. Where do you think it took aim? The President's mansion. It severed it right in half. So the contemporary drawings you will see, and it looks exactly like two separate buildings. Now that stone structure took 10 years to build. And it was the one that Mr. Adams, our second president, occupied with Mrs. Adams before it was fully complete. And so therefore, that is the reason that Mrs. Madison and I do not reside in the President's mansion anymore, but my hope is that it will be rebuilt in time for our next president to do so. And that is the story of the weather and the invasion of Great Britain. And by the way, we are at a time of peace now, so we can all rest a bit, and hopefully some of our governmental energies will be put towards some internal improvements. I'm very much in favor of canals. We know we have some new technology with the steamboat, and that's going to increase or decrease the travel time for goods and services to be transported overland through waterways and canals that may be built. And I'm hoping that that answers your question sufficiently. Yes, ma'am.
What were you saying about who was the Merriweather expedition? Were you residing, were you president when this was going on?
Marilyn is asking about, Marlene,
Yeah.
I'm terribly sorry, Marlene is asking about the Corps of Discovery. 10 years ago in 1806, when I was the Secretary of State under Mr. Mr. Jefferson administration, he was very interested in expanding our territory. So we needed to find out what was out there first, indeed. So Meriwether Lewis, who was kind of a biologist and a very intellectual man, he chose, and William Clark, who was the son of George Rogers Clark, one of our heroes in the American Revolution out in the Illinois country, was the second. And they headed out to try and find the Pacific Northwest. And on their way, they just documented everything. And they sent back samples of flora and fauna of all kinds and species that had never been discovered before. And part of it was to prove a false tenet that they would say in Europe, that all of your trees and animals and plants are inferior in the Americas than they are in Europe, which of course is not the case. And when they returned, they brought animals and furs and specimens, and so Mr. Jefferson makes it a habit to try different plants on his garden. And he calls me a good planter, which I don't consider myself really a great planter. I let my overseers take care of that, however. The reason Mr. Jefferson's gardens never succeed is he's always experimenting with these odd things that are being sent to him. But he documents everything, so this works and that doesn't work, and for what reason? You know, the katydids got them, or the bugs got them, or the weather got them, or the soil is too this, or the weather is too that. But Meriwether Lewis became Mr. Jefferson's personal secretary. And so when he moved into the White House in 1801, it's this giant cavernous building, and there was only 2 people in it, he and Meriwether Lewis. So you can imagine the echo that must have taken place there. So it's been said many times that my wife, Mrs. Madison, became the First Lady under Mr. Jefferson's administration, which is only partially true, I would say. You see, Mr. Jefferson's habit was not to entertain the ladies as much as it is Mrs. Madison's, and my habit to entertain all genders, both genders, at our house. He decided that he wanted to curry favor with men that would help prosper the Republican point of view and the Republican philosophy in our government. And so he would entertain in small groups and always with men of the same mind in order to reinforce the strategy, I would say. But it was Mrs. Madison that was invited in if his daughter was not available. If his daughter was not available, she would come in and she would make sure that the ladies were well informed and well entertained and well educated during the different discourses that he would have with the ladies. But when we assumed the presidency as a couple, here's a funny statement. Yeah, I told you that I defeated Charles Coltsworth Pinckney from South Carolina. Mr. Pinckney, I recall, said something like, I believe I ran against Mr. and Mrs. Madison, and I would have had a better chance if I had run against just Mr. Madison instead. That's how influential my wife is. There is not a person that Mrs. Madison does not affect on a positive level. It could be our worst enemy. It could be Melly Melly from Tunisia, one of the Tripolitan pirates, and she will be in love. And he will be in love with Mrs. Madison. Because not only does everyone love Mrs. Madison, you see the opposite is also true. Mrs. Madison loves everyone else. She is truly a remarkable woman. I hope that answered your question, madam. Anything else? Yes, indeed.
How are you grooming your Secretary of State to take?
The question Linda asks is, how am I grooming the Secretary of State, which is Mr. James Monroe, also from Virginia, to assume the presidency? Very much like Mr. Jefferson groomed me. So I could take my lesson from Mr. Jefferson because I've always considered him a mentor of mine, him being, as I mentioned before, 8 years my senior. And so we had sent him on various missions. He may not be as flagrant or colorful with his words as Mr. Jefferson is, but he's extremely down-to-earth, practical, and highly hardworking, and very capable. So we sent him to London. We've sent him to Paris. He was there during the Reign of Terror in France, or during the French Revolution. So he's very well versed in diplomatic and international diplomatic matters, as well as domestic matters, serving not only as my Secretary of State, but Secretary of War. during the conflict that we had described before when we were invaded and my Secretary of War, Mr. Armstrong, I booted him out and put Mr. Monroe in his place because he was actually quite incompetent. And so I would say that we did it the same way with a variety of situations that occurred over a course of 2 terms. I hope that answered your question. Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
Your dress, or your, you know, your attire, your attire. Now, was that de rigueur at all times, or did you dress down at any time? I mean, what did you wear to relax?
I believe I can't reveal that.
Where are you going with this?
De rigueur, however, is this outfit right here. Now you can see that I am wearing breeches, which is not technically the style you see in 18 and 16.
And you stole my shoes.
I stole your shoes. Well, these are called mules, and they are the current style. Sometimes I still wear buckled shoes, but I decided to wear these today. I don't have a variety of clothes. I mean, you bring up a good point. Black seems to be my favorite color. And even my top hat is black, and I wear black and white, and it's just the way I am. Mrs. Madison has all the fashion sense, you see. She wears all the latest fashions from Paris, and we make sure of that. But as a President of the United States, here in company amongst my constituents, I shall dress as if I'm dressed in the Capitol. And this seems to be the style of the day, with the exception of the breeches. But I will tell you, to support the embargo that Mr. Jefferson had in his administration, I wore a suit at the inauguration of myself as the Secretary of State in clothes that were all made in America, and I was sported trousers for that day. But mostly I still prefer to wear the breeches.
Okay.
I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does.
At least part of it.
Part of it.
Anything else? Yes, Linda?
What do you do to relax, you and Mrs. Madison?
Oh, we are quite different. Linda's question was, what do I do to relax? Well, we're quite different in...
They're getting personal again, aren't they?
All these women.
Well, one thing that these questions help me do is to give you an awareness of my personality. You see, I have a somewhat stoic reputation, if you're not aware. I've been called everything from a withered little apple John to a pygmy, to the most unsociable creature on this God-given earth, and other various epithets. But I do have another side. Do you think that Mrs. Dolly Madison, the most vivacious woman in this entire country, would pick me, little Jemmy Madison, to marry if I did not have another side? So actually, when I am in close company with people that I am comfortable with, I don't mind answering these questions and showing a bit of my wit and a little bit of my sense of humor that I do